Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned temporarily. I don't know if I'll have any other videos up this week. We will have to see. But I felt like doing this one today. It's my weekend reading report. My weekend reading report where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. Or in this case, the previous, 2 weeks? Something like that. I can't keep track of time. I think it's been a couple weeks. And so this is where I talk about all the stuff that I've been reading. And I've been reading some stuff. So yeah, I thought I'd talk about it. So here I am talking about it. So on the 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books that I already own before I will buy any new ones. Book number, what was I at? 145 was this book, which I've talked about before the last time I did a weekend reading report, which was The Mark of Zorro. This is Zorro, The Complete Pulp Adventures, Volume 1 by Johnston McCulley. And I had read The Mark of Zorro, which is part of Roger's Cheapo Book Club. And I really liked The Mark of Zorro, but there were a couple other stories in this book that are worth mentioning. There are two short stories that come after The Mark of Zorro. We have Zorro Saves a Friend, and we also have, after that, Zorro Hunts a Jackal. And they're pretty good stories. So Johnston McCulley, he only intended Zorro to be in one story, which was his novel, The Curse of Capistrano, which was renamed The Mark of Zorro after the film The Mark of Zorro was a tremendous success. And the film also convinced him that, I should bring this character back because everybody really likes Zorro. So he brought back this character that he never intended to bring back. And we know he never intended to bring this character back because Zorro gives away his secret identity at the end of The Mark of Zorro. But Johnston McCulley just decides to ignore that for Zorro stories going forward. He did an interesting thing here. Now, originally when I was reading this, I thought, well, maybe the following stories are actually prequels to The Mark of Zorro. Because Zorro was around already when The Mark of Zorro, the novel, started. So I thought maybe they're prequels, but it turns out they're not. And I read a little bit about the very odd and inconsistent chronology of the Zorro stories. And what Johnston McCulley did is he just ignored stuff that happened in The Mark of Zorro. He ignored the fact that Zorro gave away his secret identity. He ignored some other things. He changed some stuff around when Zorro came back for the short stories. For example, Zorro is engaged to be married, and his future father-in-law, he was a character you got to know pretty well in The Mark of Zorro. He returns, only now he seems to know Zorro's secret identity. Like he's either figured it out or he was told or something, but he seems to know who Zorro really is, which was not the case in The Mark of Zorro. So that's been changed. There are other things that have been changed. So if you're really into continuity, you will have trouble with the Zorro series because McCulley didn't care too much about continuity. He just was like, I'll just do what I want as far as continuity goes. And so he retconned a lot of things when in the Zorro stories. And from what I've read, he never was very consistent. And he would do this throughout the series. He would just, change things if he felt he wanted to change them and just forget about whatever was in the last story. And this could drive, I think, some people crazy. If continuity is really important to you, this would be troubling. But, Zorro is more of a legend than anything else. And legends can be that way. They don't always follow a strict continuity. Details change, And so that's okay. The stories were really good. Both the stories were really good. And so I finished up Zorro. Anyway, I'll shut up about Zorro now. That was book 145. Book 146 was The Lost Wagon Train by Zane Grey. So it is June on the Range, a reading event where we celebrate Western fiction. So most of these books that I read in the last couple of weeks, have been Westerns. The Lost Wagon Train by Zane Grey. This was excellent. This is a really good Western novel by Zane Grey about dastardly criminals who team up with some renegade Native Americans to destroy wagon trains, attack wagon trains and destroy them, slaughter everybody in the wagon train, and just basically steal all the stuff out of the wagon train. And then they dump the wagons themselves over a cliff. And the wagon trains just seem to disappear and nobody knows, what happened to them. One of the criminals this book follows, the leader of this outlaw gang. He's not the hero of the book, although he is one of the main characters. The hero, actually, the character you can identify as a hero, doesn't show up until halfway through the book. And even as a hero, he's not perfect. This is interesting because you have a lot of morally gray characters. This outlaw who tries to stop being an outlaw and settle down to a normal life, his crimes are unforgivable. He has committed unforgivable crimes. Literally, he ordered the massacre of women and children, as well as, just innocent men. So he ordered the massacre of all of these people. And he did order, leave nobody left alive to identify us. And so it's hard to sympathize with this guy. Although you do end up sort of sympathizing with him, even though you can never really forgive him because he's done something unforgivable. The descriptions of the Western landscape are beautiful, as usual in the Zane Grey book. The characters, there's some great characters in here, although the way Zane Grey makes people speak, they speak in a way that no human being ever would ever speak. Just very melodramatic dialogue. But that's okay. It's an excellent book. I mean, there are some old-timey things that stand out to you when you read it now. The characters in Zane Grey books, for the characters in Zane Grey books, there never was a racial slur that they didn't like. A lot of racial slurs thrown around in this book, although that is the way a lot of these characters would actually speak, and that would be their attitudes, I'm sure, at the time that the story took place. The non-white characters aren't actually shown to be inferior to the white characters. In fact, most of the white characters in this book are pretty terrible. But yeah, there are a lot of racial slurs. Native Americans are described as savages, even though the things that the white people are doing are even more savage. You get that. That's something that you would expect for when this book was written. And like I said, that's how these people would actually talk back then, I'm sure. Excellent book, though. Very good Western. Really enjoyed it. Lost Wagon Train by Zane Grey. That was a winner. Then I read... What book is this? Book 147, To Tame a Land by Louis L'Amour. One of the greatest Western writers of all time, if not the greatest Western writer of all time, Louis L'Amour. To Tame a Land was an earlier novel by Louis L'Amour, which is all about Rye Tyler, who killed 10 men before he was 20 years old or something like that. He killed all kinds of people. Rye Tyler, whose father was killed by Native Americans when their wheel broke and the wagon train they were with left them behind. So his father was killed, but he survives, and he meets a former gunman who teaches him how to shoot and teaches him how to survive in the wilderness. Rye goes off on his own after this and has a life of adventure and eventually becomes a lawman. And this is all told from Rye Tyler's point of view. So it's basically the story of his life. It's an excellent book. This is excellent. The one thing about it, though, is this is told first person. It's Rye Tyler telling the story of his life. And because of the way it's told and because the way this character is presented, when you're hearing this story, it's kind of like, you know, you're sitting around in a bar somewhere and this guy's just telling you his life story. And he's really embellishing it, you know. Like, you just don't believe half of what this guy says because he makes himself out to be, you know, invincible. I mean, he can outshoot everybody. He can outfight everybody. He's the toughest guy around. He's, you know, he's got a lot of modesty, which comes off as false modesty. He's just making himself, it seems like, he's trying to build himself up in this story and make himself look like, you know, the toughest, greatest gunman ever, who frequently laments the fact that he's a gunman and he wishes he didn't, you know, have to kill people all the time. I guess you could just stop shooting people. I guess you could have done that. But no, he was always forced to. You know, he always killed people against his will. Kind of feels like he had some other choices, though, frequently. But that's okay. It's an excellent book. It's just like, it's basically you're listening to some guy tell tall tales about his life. And you don't believe half of it because it's like, nobody could do this. But okay, we'll go along with it. And it is an excellent book. Don't get me wrong. And actually, the end of the book, at the end of the book, it's the only time in the book, the very end, is when you feel that this character is in any real danger and is possibly over his head at the end of the book. And something happens at the end of the book that really surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. It came off as a surprise. And so I definitely recommend this. It's a lot of fun. I enjoyed it quite a bit. To Tame a Land by Louis L'Amour. That's a good book. I recommend it. Then, book 148 on the 500 book challenge is Posse from Hell. Posse from Hell, which I got for $1 at the bookshop in Hayward many, many, many years ago. Posse from Hell by Claire Huffaker. They made this into a film. It was an Audie Murphy film, I think. I believe I saw it, although I don't really remember much about it. It's probably not as good as the book, though. The book is fantastic. Posse from Hell by Claire Huffaker, about these evil gunmen that ride into town and kill a bunch of people and ride off. You know, they're going to another town and they're going to kill a bunch of people there. And so this young marshal, Banner Cole, needs to put a posse together. But most of the people in the town are too cowardly to go along with him in the posse. So he only has like 6 people to go along with him in the posse. And half the people in this posse are just no good. But there are a couple people in the posse that turn out to be surprisingly super tough and super reliable. Like the banker, who always seemed like a wimpy guy and is kind of a wimpy guy, turns out to be pretty courageous and turns out to be one of the most reliable people in the posse. And there's a Native American guy that people always thought was just some, you know, no account Indian, you know. He turns out to be very reliable and, you know, a very brave guy who people just look down on, basically because he was quiet and because he's Native American. It's an interesting book. It's very short, but in this, how many pages? It's like 128 pages long. But within those pages, Huffaker manages to create realistic characters, some of whom are evil and terrible, and some are very heroic. But even the heroic characters, you know, they're flawed. There are no perfect characters in this book. It was interesting reading this after reading the Louis L'Amour book. Because in the Louis L'Amour book, To Tame a Land, you had a character who was larger than life and not very realistic. because he just seemed invulnerable most of the time and could just literally defeat anybody without trouble. Here we have some real characters some characters that seem like real people. And the story comes off as much more realistic. It was interesting to read this after the Louis L'Amour book. This was better than the Louis L'Amour book. This is a fantastic Western, Posse from Hell. If you ever find this lying around, pick it up because it is excellent. Pretty basic plot. This posse goes after these outlaws who are out to kill a bunch of folks indiscriminately. You know, that's basically the plot, but full of action, great story, excellent characters, pretty much everything you could want in a 128-page Western. So Posse from Hell, this was fantastic. As far as what I'm reading now, it is Book Trek, as well as being June on the Range. It's also Book Trek. Book Trek is a reading event created by Vin over at Revenant Reads. And it is the summer of Trek, where we read Star Trek books all summer long. So I'm reading this one right at the moment. This is Star Trek The Next Generation, A Call to Darkness, which takes place during the second season. There's the much maligned Dr. Pulaski, who actually I kind of miss, actually, it turns out. I'm happy to read about Dr. Pulaski. So I've only ever read one other Star Trek The Next Generation novel. And that was called Ghost Ship. And I read that during the first Book Trek a few years ago. And that was absolutely terrible. I remember that just being awful. This, however, is pretty good. I'm kind of surprised. I'm not too far into it. What am I on? Page 58? I'm on page 58. And so far, it's a really good book. This one is written by Michael Jan Friedman. And so I've been impressed so far. The characters all seem to be acting like themselves. Good Star Trek plot so far. It feels like a Star Trek episode. And it's pretty good. So far, it could just turn to crap. You never know. But so far, pretty good. So I'm reading this for Book Trek. Probably the only book I'll read this month for Book Trek. Maybe I'll read one or two next month. We will see. But so far, I'm reading this. But I also read another book. And this book was book 149 in the 500 book challenge. And that was this one. This is The Mighty Thor. It's reflecting the light. The Mighty Thor in Mortal Flesh. This is Thor Epic Collection, Volume 17. This collects Thor stories from 1989 through 1990. I am reading every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor, which did run from the early 60s until the mid-1990s. And so I've completed another decade of Thor. I've read every single issue of Thor up through the 1980s. And so I'm reading Thor's last decade right now, or the last decade of Thor's first run. This was pretty good. It's not as good as the comics that were in the last Epic collection. This has Thor issues up through 418. We still have stories by DeFalco. Tom DeFalco, and Ron Frenz does most of the art in this. Ron Frenz, who likes to draw Thor just like Jack Kirby drew Thor, is kind of toning down the Jack Kirby imitations at this point and is drawing a little bit more like himself. And when I say he's drawing a little bit more like himself, he's drawing a little bit more like Sal Buscema, who he resembles quite a bit when he's just being Ron Frenz. But he is really good. Ron Frenz is really good. And so, it's cool stuff. It's Thor. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I am continuing Thor, and right now I'm reading this one. This is Thor the Black Galaxy, which continues DeFalco and Ron Frenz run on Thor. The interesting thing about these stories is that at this point, Thor has gotten a secret identity again. We had the lame Dr. Donald Blake was Thor's secret identity for a long time. Then when Walt Simonson took over the book, he got rid of lame Dr. Blake, because none of us like Dr. Blake, and we were all happy to see him go. But now we have Eric Masterson, who's an architect, and Eric Masterson and Thor have been combined into one person somehow. And so we're back to the old thing where he's Eric Masterson until he taps his cane on the ground and then he turns into Thor. I don't think Thor needs a secret identity. I don't know that it adds too much to the character. But this does give us a bunch of supporting characters we wouldn't otherwise have. Eric Masterson and his family. Hercules is on the book regularly now, and I love Hercules, so that's kind of cool. So Thor's going well. I don't think it will ever be as good again as it was when Walt Simonson was writing the book, but it's good stuff. So Thor continues to be good at this point. From what I remember, towards the end of the first run of Thor, Thor becomes kind of ridiculous. But at this point, he's not ridiculous yet. So Thor, the Black Galaxy, I'm reading that. And I think that's everything. I think that's everything for my weekend reading report. Like I said, I don't know when I'll be back. It just kind of depends on circumstances. We will see. But whenever it is, I will catch you next time.